class, how many classes are there? You count. In all those classes, there is a constructor. In all those classes, there is a constructor. What do you call it? Implicit constructor. What do you call it? Is a implicit constructor. You'll have a doubt now. Sir, in my previous classes, instances are not created now. You create or don't create the instance, that's your problem. But compiler job is to define a constructor. You did not create it today, but tomorrow you can create now. Who knows? Did you catch my point or not? Today you may not create an instance, but tomorrow you can create an instance here. Who knows that? That's why compiler will automatically define a constructor. First it checks here. Did the developer define a constructor? Yes. Okay, then compiler won't do anything now. No. Then compiler will write the constructor of the class. Did you catch my point? See, for example, look at this, all of you. I'm writing a class test. I'm writing a class first. Class defined as below. A class defined as below. This is a class, what is defined for you. Okay? Class defined as below. Okay, now, after compilation, it will be as below. After compilation, it will be as below. How? Class test. Now, look at this, guys. In this class, there will be a constructor. How? Public test. So what is this? And what did I say? The name of the constructor is exactly the same name of your method now. And other point I said, it's a method. See that? Braces are there. Braces. When you braces, that is a method. And what type of method? Non-value returning method. See there. It's a non-value returning method. So with non-value returning, why you did not write void? No need, guys. Normal method has two options. Value returning, non-value returning. Then I should say void to tell it is non-value returning. But constructor has only one option only. Why to tell again? Array, constructor doesn't have two options now. How many options you have? One only. What is that? Non-value returning. So no need to tell. So this is how we define a constructor. Okay. Now what is the need of this constructor, sir? The need of the constructor is to initialize the fields of a class. The need of a constructor is to initialize the fields of a class. Do you remember we discussed it last week? What we discussed is fields of a class will have default value if not initialized with a value. Fields of a class will have a default value. For example, I'm saying int I, bool B, string S. Look at this now. Did I initialize them? No. But all the three will have a default value. What is the default value of I? 0. P, false. Yes, null. String is null. So these are the default values. Okay, they are the default values. Did I assign them? No. And without assigning, how do you get these default values? Without assigning, how do you get the default values? This is a question. It's not a magic show. Without you assigning values coming up there now. Okay, then how do you get this, sir? How do you get this is, actually, this constructor will do that. Actually, what is the code in the constructor, you know? Watch. I is equals to 0, P is equals to false, S is equals to, this is what the constructor does to you. Did you understand the duty of the constructor? Constructor is to initialize the fields of your class. And remember that the first point I said you, all of you can read this. Responsible for what? Initializing the fields of that class. Initializing the fields of that class. Remember guys, in this process, suppose at the time of declaration, all of you, look at this. Sorry. So this is the code we write and this is the code after compilation. Are you following me? This after compilation, this will be like this guys. Okay. Now guys, at the time of declaration, you are assigning a value to this. At the time of declaration, you are assigning a value to this. if you assign a value to this, what happens, constructor also will initialize the field with that value. Constructor also will initialize the field with that value. What value you said? 100. So constructor is also initializing with the same value. If you give a value, it will take the same value. If you don't give a value, it will take the default value. If you give a value, it will take the same value. No, you did not give a value. Then it will take the default value. Are you clear? Okay. Now, another point here. Variables have default values, or should I assign them? Variables, not fields. Variables have default value, or should I assign them? Will have a default value, yes or no? Variables. Brainless fellows. Variable doesn't have default value here. That's what I'm telling you. You're not reading at all. You're unfit. You're not reading at all, coming to the classes and giving the wrong answers all. Last week I explained and today you forget. And you go to interviews and change out the company's fate. Variable doesn't have a default value. Default values are only for fields. I much clearly explained you about that one also. A variable should be initialized at the time of declaration or before consumption. Practically shown you all these things to you. Who has default value? Field or variable? Field. But not a variable. Why, sir? Variable. Why variable doesn't have a default value? The reason why variable doesn't have a default value is, what is the scope of a variable? What is the scope of a variable? Local. Local means in a particular block. In a particular block. You declared it in a method, you can access it only in the method. You declare it in a method, you can access it only in a method. So what is the scope of it? Particular method. Are you getting my point or not? The scope of it is within a particular method. Out of the method it is not accessible. A block of code. Array. That much clearly we are talking. What is it? The scope of a variable is within a block. Cannot be accessed out of the block. If it cannot be accessed out of the class, how can the constructor access it and initialize it here? If it is not accessible out of the class, not accessible to constructor also. If it is not accessible to constructor, constructor cannot initialize it. That is the reason why what they say, variables are not accessible to constructor, so constructor cannot initialize. You only do that. Who should do? Developer only should do that. Because that is not accessible to constructor. If it is accessible to constructor, constructor will do. But variables are not accessible to constructor. That's why in case of variables, what they say, variables are developer's job and fields can be initialized by, fields also can be initialized by developers here. If developer doesn't do, constructor will do that. Are you clear? Why variable? Tomorrow someone can ask you a question. Why, how a field will have a default value, why a variable doesn't have a default value? What is the answer? Variables are not accessible to constructor. So constructor cannot initialize them. So it is our responsibility to initialize. But when you come to fields, fields are accessible to constructor. So constructor can initialize them. Point clear all of you? So did you understand the role of a constructor? Yes or not? Now tell me, constructor is mandatory or optional? Mandatory or optional? Mandatory, not optional. Constructor is mandatory. Either you define or compiler will define. Either you define or compiler will define. Clearer? Okay? And now, what do we have now? Implicit constructor. What do we have now? Implicit constructor. And remember all of you, implicit constructors are public. Implicit constructors are public. This is implicitly defined, guys, and it is a public constructor. Put this in the mind. I'll come back somewhere. I'll just talk on this particular thing. But implicit constructors are public constructors. Don't forget this. Now, sir, can I define a constructor on my own? Can I define this constructor on my own? Yes, you can also define a constructor. How? How can I define a constructor? Syntax. True. Define a constructor. Look at this, guys. How to define a constructor? Syntax to define a constructor. Modifiers, name, parameter list, What's that code, guys? The code is exactly same as your method syntax only. What is missing? Void or type is missing there, that's all. Other than this is method syntax. Here, if I add void or type, what is it? Method. If I remove this, construct. That's all. Constructors can be defined like this, or defined like this one. Shall we try doing it on our own now? Shall we try doing it on our own? Let me add a new class. I will name it as con demo. I will name it as con demo. Watch it, all of you. Public con demo. Now tell me, this implicit or explicit? Is implicit or explicit? Brainless fellows, explicit here. If compiler does implicit, you are doing when you do, why are calling implicit now? It is a explicit constructor. If compiler does it, that is called implicit constructor. If I write, that is called explicit constructor. So this is not implicit constructor now. This is a explicit constructor. Okay? And here I am writing console dot write line. Something here. I'm just going to write constructor is called. Constructor is called. Next, I'm writing a method on my own. Public void demo. What is this method? This is a method. Method is called. So what's the code? You have one constructor in the code. We have one method in the code. Now come to main. Answer my point here. Will a method execute? Will a method execute without being called? Will a method execute without being called? No. The method won't execute without being called. Already we learnt about it. 2 days back I said to you, every method defined in a class should be called explicitly. Yes or not? Should I call it or not? I should explicitly call it. I should explicitly call it. So no method. Same way, a constructor also will not execute without getting called. A constructor also will not execute without being called. So do I require to call the constructor also? Yes. You require to call the constructor also, guys. You require to call the constructor also. Constructor should be called. How do you call the constructor? Just a second, I'll tell you. Okay, I created an instance here. Okay. Run this. Constructor called. And now you'll have a doubt. Where did you call, sir? I called it here. Where you called?
బాబాయ్ బాబాయ్ ప్రస్తుతం క్లాస్లో ఉన్నా బాబాయ్. క్లాస్ ఆన్లైన్ క్లాస్.
Are you following me? Memory is allocated. All this we are interconnected. I repeat again. Instance created. What happens? Constructor called. Next, memory allocated. Okay? Now watch. Con demo. One more instance created now. One more time memory will be allocated now. Just now I explained you now how many instances you get, that memory will be allocated for you. Okay? So what is the identification? Constructor gets called to you, memory will be allocated. Now, tell me this one, guys. Con demo CD3. What is this? Variable, no memory allocation. Is equals to CD2. What is this? Reference, no memory allocation. Reference also doesn't have memory allocation. Yes or not? Why? Because reference is not calling the constructor. Watch it. Link that one. What I explained half an hour back. Now come on, link with this. You'll understand your points now. What is it? Reference doesn't have a memory allocation. Already said you, shown you. Why? Because reference doesn't call a constructor. Memory is allocated for instance. Why? Instance will call the constructor. So memory is allocated for only the one to who will call the constructor. So CD1 calling the constructor. CD2 calling the constructor. CD3 not calling the constructor. So no memory allocated for the CD3. I hope you guys are clear now why references doesn't have memory allocation. A reference doesn't have a memory allocation because a reference doesn't call a constructor. Who calls constructor? Instance only will call. So instance only have memory allocation. Okay? So actually guys, when I 2 days back I remember I said you 3 days back or 4 days back I said you syntax to create an instance. How to create the instance I said you? Class name, instance name is equals to new class name. New class name. This is what I said. You remember now? Sorry guys, I said you wrong. That is the syntax. Are you clearer or not? But what did I say class name? Is there any problem if I say class name? Tell me. Is there any problem if I say class name there? No. Why? Class name and constructor name are same only. Even though you say class name also no problem. Even I say constructor name also no problem. But exactly speaking that is not class name. What is that? Constructor. That is a constructor guys. Class name, instance name is equals to new, constructor name, list of values. Okay, what's the code? Condemo obj is equals to new condemo. And what is this? Calling the constructor. So guys, that's nothing but calling the constructor actually. This particular statement is calling the constructor. See, if constructor is called, then only memory allocation is performed. So, instances of a class will have memory allocation because they call the constructor explicitly, whereas reference of a class will not have memory allocation because they do not call the constructor. Is the point clear for all of you? Any doubts? Understood? Now come back here. Now read the three things again. Reads the classes to identify the members. It will read the classes and identify each and every member of the class. What are the fields of the class? What are the methods of the class? What are the constructors of the class? Still 5 more members are there here. We are going to learn. Wait, one by one I am explaining you. First fields, next methods, now constructors. We'll talk about everything. It will identify. Second step, invokes the constructor of those classes. Remember guys, constructor is mandatory or optional? What we discussed? Mandatory now? So now that constructor is called. When the constructor is called, see the link. When the constructor is called, all the fields are initialized. All the fields are initialized. In that process, memory will be allocated. See the third point now. 2 and 3 are interconnected now. Constructor called. Fields are initialized, means memory is allocated. So now it is going to allocate the memory that is required for execution. I hope it is clear. Yeah, you can use constructor private also. If you use constructor private, you cannot use in other classes. If you use constructor public, you can use in other classes. That's all. If the say, program class instance you created in test program, remember all of you? Program class instance you created in a test program now 2 days back. Yes or not? And you remember that? Here we did not define a constructor explicitly. What constructor is there? Implicit. And what did I say you 10 minutes back? Implicit constructors are public. Implicit constructors are public. So you are able to go to program class and create the instance of it. But if the constructor is private, you cannot create the instance of the class in another class now. If the program class constructor is private, the instance of the program class cannot be created in test program. Are you guys clear? This is the reason why, by default, implicit constructors are public constructors, giving a chance for creating the instance in other classes. But here also, I do define as public only. But if I just go for defining it private, now I cannot create the instance of the con demo class in another class. Now can I do? Yes. Now you can do. But if it is private, you cannot do. Is it clear? So this is a question raised by someone. Yeah. Ahmed, is it clear now? Okay. So now constructor is called. Now what about this method? Method also should be called here. We need to call a method. How to call a method? You can call a method by using instance, or you can call a method by using reference also. You cannot call by variable, that's all. Instance also can call, reference also can call. See that. cd1 dot demo, cd2 dot demo, and cd3 dot demo. All the three will give you access. Any doubt with the role of a constructor and how to define a constructor for all of you? What is the need of a constructor? Actually responsible for the memory allocation. It's actually responsible for the memory allocation. Constructor called only, memory will be allocated. See, all these three are interconnected with each other. Instance created, constructor called, memory allocated. Are you clear? Come in the reverse order. Memory allocated means constructor called means instance is created. Memory allocated means constructor called means instance created. Memory not allocated means constructor not called means what you created is not an instance. What you created is not a instance. What is it? It can be a reference. It can be a reference. No memory allocation will be present for you, but the references. I hope it's clear for all of you. First I'm giving an idea what is a constructor, that's all. How to use it will go forward and understand. Okay? Now, I have few questions before you. Question number 1. Question number 1. Watch. Constructors are defined implicitly or explicitly, or must be defined explicitly. Don't look into your notes. I'm saying you every day, you're doing the same thing every day. Answer. That is not true or false, guys. The question is, constructors are defined implicitly or must be defined explicitly? Implicita, explicita. Both is wrong answer. Why you know? If the implicit is there, explicit won't be there. If explicit be there, implicit won't be there. The answer is either or. What is that? Either or means, anyway, choice is yours. If you implicit, if there is no explicit, then you have implicit. If there is an explicit, then no implicit. Both won't be there, guys. Are you clear? I define one constructor, compiler define one constructor, won't happen. If I define, compiler won't define. Clear or not? If I don't define, compiler will define. So what is the answer? Either or. Okay. Next. Constructors must be called explicitly or called implicitly. Come on, answer this question. Constructors must be called explicitly or called implicitly. Explicit is the right answer. Already said here. I already said you and shown you now. Constructors must be explicitly called. Did you understand the difference between defining and calling? Don't be confused with this. When your question is about defining, the answer is either or. When your question is about calling, the answer is explicit. What is the difference between defining and calling? Defining a constructor is like cooking the food. Calling a constructor is like eating the food. You are hungry. You are hungry. You are hungry. So you want to eat some food. You can cook the food or someone can cook the food for you. Right or not? You can cook the food or someone can cook the food for you. Chances are there either or. But who has to eat the food here? If someone eats the food, is your hunger satisfied? Who has to eat the food? If I eat the food only, my hunger. See, understand, calling is explicit, means I should eat the food. Defining can be done by me or compiler also. See, cooking can be done by me or someone also. But eating, someone eats, I won't satisfy my hunger. I only should eat the food. Are you clear with both the two questions and answers? Okay, so that's what. Next. Constructors are two types. Constructors are two types. What are the two types? Default constructors, parameterized constructors. Default constructors, parameterized constructors. What is a default constructor and what is a parameterized constructor? Default constructor means a constructor without any parameters is called as default constructor. A constructor without any parameters is called as default constructor. Guys, all of you look. The constructor is default constructor only now, no parameters. Are you clear? And if you define a constructor with any parameters, that is called as parameterized constructor. We call it as a parameterized constructor. For example, watch. I am writing a class called param con demo. Previous one is con demo. Now I am calling param con demo. Public param con demo, public param con demo, and here I'm just going to write, guys, what? Int I. I'm going to write int I. Param con demo, int I. Now see, guys, this is a parameterized constructor. Are you clear? Default means without parameters, parameterized means with parameters. So constructors are two types. Default constructors are nothing but parameterless constructors. Parameterized constructor means a constructor with parameters. Okay now? And now listen to this carefully. Who can define a default constructor? Who can define a default constructor? A default constructor can be defined by a programmer or will be defined by a compiler. Why you are telling compiler? You also define now. See, you defined it, see? So who can define a default constructor? Either by a programmer or if there is no constructor, then compiler. Are you clear? Who can define a parameterized constructor? Programmer only. Did you catch my point or not? Default constructors can be defined by a programmer or will be defined by the compiler, provided no constructor in the class. But when you talk about parameterized constructors can be defined only by programmer. Compiler never defines parameterized constructors. Compiler always defines default constructors only to you. Is it clear, all of you? Yes or not? Who can define default? Either a programmer or compiler. Who can define a parameterized? Only programmer. Only programmer. Tomorrow, there's a question in the interview. There's a question in the interview. What the interview is? In a predefined class, there is a default constructor. Who defined it? This is the question. Listen guys, in a predefined class, there is a default constructor. Who defined it? What's your answer? Programmer or compiler? Either or, miss. That is okay for this question, not for this question. Either or is for this question, not for this question. The answer is can't say. I can't say, guys. How can I say? Why? Just now I said to you guys, default constructors can be defined either by a programmer or by the compiler, provided there is no constructor in the class. You are telling there is a default constructor. How do I know who defined it? Are you clearer or not? I cannot say. Maybe compiler or developer, that is only no. Cannot say. That may be a compiler or that can be a developer. I can't say that. But the question is, do you have the answer? The answer is quite clear here. Who defined it? Programmer defined it. It's purely defined by the programmer. Are you clear? Okay? Now, just come back here. You have a parameterized constructor in the code now? Now I am writing. What's it? Console dot write line. Parameterized constructor is called. Now guys, can I use I value here? I value I'm printing you there. Okay now? Parameterized constructor is called. Next, static void main. Create instance. When you create an instance, will you call the constructor or not? When you create an instance, when you call the constructor or not? Now see, I'm getting an error when I am calling the constructor now. Why? Because the constructor signature is not matching to the constructor call. The constructor signature watch, it takes an integer parameter. But here you did not pass it now. I'm passing it now, 100. I'm passing it now. Array, that only here. When I explained to you about instance creation, I said you na. List of values. I did not show you what is the use of that now. You guys understood when should I use that list of values? If constructors are parameterized, values to the parameters should be sent while creating the instance. How? Like this. See now, I'll create you 3 instances. And pass 3 values also to it. Console dot readline. And come here, execute. Paramcon demo. Are you people clear? So if a constructor is parameterized, how to send a value? We need to send a value while creating the instance of the class. Are you clear? If the method is parameterized, we send values when we call the method. Constructor parameterized, we send values when we call the constructor. When we call the constructor, when instance is created, we call the constructor. Then we pass the values. And all the values what you pass here will go inside and your methods are going to be executed for you in the process. So this is how. If a constructor is not parameterized and modified is private, who is responsible? Responsible for what? Responsible for what here? Who is responsible for what? Tell that first. Simply telling who is responsible for what? Okay? So, did you guys understand my point here? Did you understand the difference between default constructors and parameterized constructors? Yes or not? Okay? So, read all these things carefully, practice them first, and tomorrow I'll teach you what is the need of constructors in your code. Today I only said you how to define a constructor, that's all. Today what I said you? How to define a constructor. Read them again and again. I'm telling you, read the notes. Tomorrow, reflect to answer the questions first. You're not even able to answer the questions here. What do you answer in interviews? Read and come to the class. Are you clear? So tomorrow I'll give you a clear picture what is the need of a constructor in our class. Okay, let's stop here. We'll meet tomorrow. What's your questions, guys? Yeah, Manish did not understand. So can we use ref out params? Yes. Ahmed, we can use ref out. All this can be used as a constructor also. Again, your question. Compiler or programmer, what is that? Sir, if a constructor is not parameterized and modifier is private, who is responsible? Responsible for what I asked you? And you're telling compiler or programmer. Responsible for what? Anand Vidya. Stop the video. Okay guys, carry on. We'll meet tomorrow. Mr. Anand Vidya, stop the video.
Recording stopped.
Your question is not clear, Manish. You're trying to ask what? Responsible for what? What is the question? Continue. Defining calling you should answer, you should say something, You're not having that responsible. Simple, that's all. Every time calling should be done by you only. Every time calling should be done by you only. Implicita, explicita, whatever it is, calling should be done by you. That's it. Defining, that can be either you defined or compiler defined. Compiler will never define private. If it is private, you only define it. Bye guys, have a nice day.